Unfortunately, the things that she's dealing with connect very closely. Unfortunately, they connect very closely with the things that we're dealing with. So it's just unfortunate that they're on the both sides at the same time. Okay, so I won't say too much before handing over to the speakers, except to say that what connects all of these papers together is the idea that we can move beyond implication. There's been a lot of discussion in ELF for some time about the pedagogical implications of our research and theory and debate. And what each of these papers does from quite different perspectives and in very different contexts is look at practical applications of ELF, integrating ELF in the curriculum in some way or another. So we have, what we're going to do is speak, each presenter will speak for 20 minutes, and we'll pause at the end of each presentation for a brief question and answer session. So first we have Sonia Moran from the University of Southampton, who is going to talk about engaging with students' metalinguistic discourses. Thank you, Sonia.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be taking part of a colloquium that's posing such a timely but also very delicate question as proposed by Martin. In seeking pedagogical implications and applications, ELF scholars have opened up a variety of lines of inquiry so far, and a lot of questioning has been going on, especially in relation to which linguistic forms we teach and how. But today I would like to talk about more representational or symbolic aspects of English. My own research activities have so far been focused on the world of language perceptions and on how these may be discursively constructed through metalinguistic talk. So for this presentation, I will be exploring the roles that conceptualizations, attitudes, or ideologies play or could play in the English language classroom, and also the pedagogical applications that metalanguage may offer to address them from an ELF-informed perspective. So the first issue that we may want to consider is whether this kind of symbolic aspects are already being addressed or whether they should be addressed in the classroom. And it seems that English has traditionally been introduced to students as a set of autonomous linguistic norms and features, as if it was some sort of objective system which is independent of social and ideological processes. However, even if this approach still seems to be prevalent in mainstream ELT, it no longer seems to coincide with contemporary understandings of what language is or how it actually works. In Canabrasha's own words, language is meshed with other symbolic systems, and so it's important to give more attention to how attitudinal, psychological, or perceptual factors may operate in language use. And of course, this also applies to language use in lingua franca intercultural interactions, so it is not surprise that it has already been pointed out that we need to move beyond teaching English or simply teaching English as a set of linguistic forms in order to also teach about Englishes. That is to actively engage learners or students into learning about the fixity and variability of the language, but also about the identificational and evaluation processes that are embedded in its use. So, as perhaps Cogo, for example, Matsuda suggests, there's a need to rethink language as a wider process that also addresses users' knowledge or attitudes, as well as other social and political aspects as well. And the relevance of developing this kind of knowledge has already been emphasized in the field in relation to teachers and teacher training. And of course, although this is indeed a crucial first step, perhaps it's also important to start considering the role that English learners can play, or probably play anyway, into the theorization of language, and also to think about how dealing with their or engaging with their awareness may also be necessary to enrich classroom practices. It is already widely acknowledged that lay users, or students as well, already play an active role in processes of conceptualizations, and thus quite complex processes of conceptualization and or identity management, for example. However, the provision of educational spaces for students to articulate and evaluate their own knowledge still seems to be largely restricted to linguistic programs. Although some students are already finding ways to challenge dominant representations in their local classrooms, as I believe one of the speakers, Lisa, will illustrate later on, there are already calls from researchers for the development of students' awareness to become part of the ELT curricula as well, so that all students have the opportunity to learn about linguistic, social, and other aspects within the lingua franca use in order to be as prepared as possible for their future English needs. As Kubota puts it here, it is both teachers and students that need to have the opportunity to be critically reflective and to engage in constant questioning of multiple ways of thinking about language. Despite the general agreement, there yet seems to be little scholarly discussion on how to actually do this from an educational perspective. And given my research background, I decided to explore whether meta-language may be a useful starting point. So now I will explain what I mean by this concept and why I consider it can be a good candidate. So meta-language can be defined as language in the context of linguistic representations and evaluations. For the rest of the presentation, I will be focusing more on the explicit meta-language, so overt references through which people actually define what language is, or what it should be, or how it works. And although this may perhaps sound rather innocent, or even of dubious value for the classroom, we mustn't forget that, as Cameron suggests, these definitions are always on inspection, about far more than just language. In fact, meta-language can be better conceptualized as a form of social practice, through which we can, for instance, assign social meanings or values to different ways of speaking, and through which we can also do or perform different kinds of identities. Of course, meta-language, as any other social practice, can also work at an ideological level, at which linguistic representations may be naturalized or modified or challenged. But perhaps more importantly, for the purpose of the colloquium, is that meta-language can also be considered to be an effective educational tool, especially in the field of critical language awareness. And this kind of premise is normally based on an understanding of knowledge as a form of discourse. So, as something that's not neutral or natural, but which needs constant critical reflexivity in order to advance. So the idea would be that by engaging in chronic revision of taken for granted understandings and new ideas as well, students or new information, students would be able to develop an awareness or an understanding of their own ideas, other people's ideas, and perhaps even generate new ideas. As Markova and colleagues suggest, when people talk and think together, they not only draw upon social knowledge, but they may also transform it. So I see meta-language as having the potential to bring perspectives in the classroom in similar ways. Perhaps, for example, through group discussions, we may encourage students to engage in critical examination of dominant representations of English, as well as alternative ones, such as the ones proposed from kind of perspectives, in relation to students' own expectations, experiences, and desires. So students could be asked perhaps to identify the different kind of ideological assumptions that underpin each of the potential alternative presentations, and also to think about the social and ideological impact that evaluating language in one or other way may have for speakers across a variety of contexts, from the very own local language classroom of those students to, for example, job interviews or informally written interactions. And to see how this may work from a more empirical perspective, I now would like to draw from a focus group study in which university students from Chile, Mexico, and Spain discussed their own views about English, but in which they were also introduced to how some ELF scholars conceptualize its lingua franca use. The study consisted of 6 focus groups, each containing from 4 to 7 undergraduates of a variety of non-language related degrees. And it's important to point out that around half of the participants had already been on exchange abroad programs, so some of them already had some experience of ELF communicative contexts. In order to simulate their discussions, I gave them this text. So it's in Spanish, you find the English version. And it is composed by a series of quotes from different publications, so I just put it together as a collage. And its purpose was to introduce some of the main ideas in the field, from general aspects of the globalization of English to more specific debates surrounding the lingua franca use. And since in the pilot some of the students found the text a little bit abstract, and sometimes they also had difficulty imagining the kind of linguistic variations that scholars were referring to, I also decided to show them extract from an ELF interaction in a business context in which one of the interlocutors produced the omission of the third person S. In terms of analysis, I am particularly interested in looking at the potential of transformation that is attributed to metalinguistic talk. So in my approach, I looked at what constructs, what ideologies, what positions are being drawn upon, with a special interest in seeing which ones are taken as shared or as fixed or stable or as negotiable. And I'm also interested in looking at how people or participants or students in particular also reinforce or modify or challenge social meanings and linguistic representations through dialogue with themselves and with others. And although the analysis of these data is still ongoing, I wanted to share with you how these processes may actually work by looking at one of the extracts from a focus group in Spain, in which 5 university students were discussing the notion of correctness and how to evaluate linguistic differences in lingua franca contexts. So this is the extract, and at this point the students had already read the text, the informative text, and they had looked at the voice extract. And they had also discussed how the omission of the third person S could be interpreted from an ELF perspective or from an EFL perspective. And then I asked them, as you can see here, to share their own thoughts on the matter. So we can see that this omission of the third person S in that particular context was very quickly defined as an error by all of the participants. Perhaps no surprise there. Perhaps to be safe or to show alignment, they all began their evaluation by drawing upon what seemed to be a socially shared or relatively stable assumption, because as you can see, they didn't even seem to need to offer any justification for this evaluation, for considering it an error. But immediately after, one of the participants else begins a process of negotiation of the nature and applicability of the notion of error. He suggests that it is an error until the norm changes, and then it's no longer considered an error. So with this kind of contribution, he's doing various things. He's invoking and rejecting the notion of error as a static construct. He is also opposing ideas of linguistic features as inherently correct or incorrect, and he is therefore suggesting that what we may consider an error or what we may consider correct or incorrect may be a matter of perception, and that there may be a degree of arbitrariness behind it. So quite complex conceptualization there. And P here seems to accept this idea of the transient nature of the notion of error, and he reformulates his evaluation of the specific linguistic feature they were looking at as an error for now. Okay?
But in doing so, he is also signaling a belief in that the kind of prescriptions of correctness that are given from language authorities can actually determine the status of a linguistic feature in a sort of top-down and acontextual manner. At this point, Elle, another participant, decides to join the negotiation process. And she suggests that this is an error because they have all thought about it in that way. So what she's doing here, she's reinforcing an earlier definition proposed that error was a matter of perception. P decides to sort of interrupt her. She's saying it is wrong, and he adds because the teacher would mark it down, right? So with this sentence, he is invoking and also identifying English teachers as a source of authority behind the prescription of this norm. But it continues. Interestingly, she says, but if it makes no sense to add the S, if it means the same and you understand equally, why would it not be an innovation? Okay? So what she's doing here, by foregrounding intelligibility over notions of correctness, she is also moving from a sort of macro level or institutional evaluative dimension into a more situational dimension. And in this situational dimension, situated dimension, we can see that perhaps she considers that those kind of prescriptive norms can actually be questioned or challenged. And so far we can see how while P is working with linguistic representations by which clear-cut boundaries of what's correct or incorrect are necessary, both P and S are collaboratively being able to push those boundaries. In the remainder of the extract, then P tries to engage with this situated dimension. But for him, if the rule for the third person X exists, there must be a reason for it. And he suggests this maybe to facilitate communication, for example. And despite having some issues to back up this argument that he's creating, he later on concludes that otherwise the S would not have included. Okay, so basically, he's here challenging earlier reformulations of norms and errors as arbitrary. But Elle decides here to suggest that the British can be very twisted. So the whole group has a little bit of a laugh about this, but I find this quite interesting because although she is identifying this collective group of speakers as another authority behind the prescription, through the humoristic tone of her comment, she can also be undermining their authority or the legitimacy. P is quite persistent in trying to find a communicative need for the S, and he suggests that because that is necessary to distinguish the subject, but halfway through the sentence he realizes that this is already obvious because of the pronoun. And I find this particularly interesting because this is a moment where he begins to realize that the assumptions he has been drawing upon can also be problematized. In fact, later on in the discussion, he even begins to bring his own examples and his own personal experiences to engage in boundary pushing or boundary challenging in terms of correctness. Although this is a very, very brief extract, I think it illustrates how these kind of dialogic activities may be helpful to address some perspectives in the classroom and also to show how we may encourage students to challenge their own taken for granted assumptions. Although I would not want to suggest that engaging with these activities would be unproblematic. In fact, considering the creation of these spaces for discourse, for reflection, can also bring a lot of challenges and a lot of limitations. In particular, in relation to material design and material selection, we would have to make complex and difficult decisions over what perspectives to include when. And one of the issues I found particularly challenging was trying to anticipate how my materials would be interpreted by the students, because I wanted to make sure that I could help them challenge some of those assumptions, but at the same time I wasn't sure whether they would perhaps even help them reinforce all dichotomies or even create new ones, which is something obviously we would want to avoid. Another particular challenge that I faced was, or that the research consideration would be, with what approach are we going to introduce different linguistic representations if we decide this is what we can do? In my case, I wanted to avoid treating ELF conceptualizations as more or less real or right than the alternatives that students were suggesting or constructing through our discussions. So I was trying to have an open approach by which students would be allowed to think and decide which representations were obsolete or more useful for them and their current needs. But of course, this kind of open approach also runs the risk of getting stuck in some circles of reflection and miss on opportunities for transformative action. So that's the kind of tension that I experienced in the focus groups. And although I have some other challenges that I can think about, for time reasons I'm going to leave them for another time and move on to the conclusion. Although this has been a very tentative exploration, I think that there are some indications of the benefits that creating spaces for metalinguistic discussion could bring to the classroom. It could be an effective way of engaging with students' knowledge and students' attitudinal orientations, and it is particularly interesting or relevant if we consider that linguistic representations or language reconceptualizations are processes that can also emerge out of the classroom rather than just into it. So it also would be a way of validating students' role in the process. And critical meta-languaging could also be useful to raise awareness over ELF-related aspects for students that have had little experience of it, but also to engage with those that may already be rethinking English in these terms on their own. Finally, although we have seen that some of my students actually experience a little bit of a transformation of their ideas within the locality of our discussions, my data cannot help us understand how this new constructed knowledge may have influenced their linguistic and metalinguistic practices beyond the focus groups. And so this is something, exploring the relationship between how reflexivity, reconceptualizing, and actual language use work and can work. That is something that I have at the top of my research agenda for the future. But perhaps, and it is my hope, that maybe some of my colleagues here today can elaborate a little bit on this, or perhaps shed more light on what I cannot provide. So unless there are any comments or questions, I will be happy to pass the floor to them. And those were my references, and thank you.
So we have about 2 minutes for questions. If anyone has a question for Sonia. Okay. Thank you very much, Sonia. So I'll hand over now to I think it's Laura. To Laura Patsko from St. George International in London, which you'll hear is a language school and teacher training centre. And he also has a link to King's College London. And she's going to tell us about talking to novice teachers about it.
Okay. So, hello. Can you hear me? Not too much, not too loud. So my name is Laura. I work at St. George International, which is a language school in London. Some of you know me already. I recognize you. Everybody else, nice to meet you. Most of what I do at the school in London is now teacher training, although I also do some English teaching as well. And most of the teacher training is training in pre-service courses, which is what I'm going to talk about. I became kind of interested in this idea of applications rather than just implications of ELF when I was doing my master's at King's, which is the connection to King's that Martin mentioned. And I started thinking about what the teachers in our school, and particularly what the teachers who were training, know or think or feel about ELF and applying it to their practice. So to give a little bit of background on the kind of connections as I see it between ELF and the industry as a whole, on the one hand you have this concept that the ELT enterprise really is the most important gatekeeper of the English language and what's being taught and what's being learnt in terms of what will be used or is being used. It's all mixed up together, as we all know. But on the other hand, we have teachers who are maybe already in service, but also just sort of fresh from their pre-service training, who don't really have much of a concept of that, the strength of that influence, and maybe don't really fully understand how English is being used around the world, either because their own experience isn't that diverse or because it hasn't been included in their training program. And this was a quotation from one of the teachers in my study last year who had done her training at our school, and a year later still said this: "I'd heard the term ELF being used once or twice, but not as often, so I thought, okay, it's not that relevant here. I don't hear people talking about it much. Do I really need to know about this?" And I remember thinking, well, yes, I think you do. And I felt a bit bad because I trained this teacher and she still didn't seem to know anything about it. So you have this kind of concept of an industry with a lot of influence into gatekeeping and who uses English and why, and influence over who will use English and why and whom and so on, but maybe quite low awareness. So just to give a little bit of background to the context that I train in, some of you will be familiar with the SALTA, I think. Some of you may also be familiar with the Trinity equivalent, the CERT TESOL, and this is the course that we offer at SGI. Just a very quick overview for those who don't know. The course is 4 weeks long, about 90 hours of input, which are sessions, kind of workshop style, on aspects of language analysis and methodology, particularly communicative language teaching. 45 plus hours of extra study, lesson preparation, projects, etc. There is also a strong teaching practice elements, observed and assessed. Observations of fellow teachers, both experienced and inexperienced. And coursework projects on language awareness tests. So there's quite a lot of stuff to be fit into this 4-week block. And the way that it's enacted in different centers is based on 2 main documents from Trinity, which are the validation requirements, so what centers need to do in order to offer this course according to Trinity, and their syllabus, so what content the course provider needs to cover. And in 4 weeks, that means that we've got quite a lot to do, and as a representative timetable, this is what our center's input session, this is mornings only, looks like. It's quite busy. You can imagine no prior experience of teaching covering all of that in 4 weeks. So they have 2 90-minute sessions every morning covering that stuff. By covering, that's quite a loose term, but you talk about it, you do tasks, you analyze it, you watch other people doing it, and so on. And in June last year, Trinity published a new syllabus, and I was interested to see something arise explicitly, which had never been mentioned before, which was ELF. In line with the new syllabus, it meant that our center had to revise our timetable slightly for other reasons too, so we had to restructure some of the teaching practice and so on and so forth. And one of my colleagues was tasked with revising our whole timetable. And as I was the most ELF-informed member of our training staff, she said to me, well, can you create a little session on ELF? So this is what I'm going to show you as examples of the session and how the tutors particularly responded to delivering it. So our question is how to include this in this. And my colleague put it there. You see it? Before? After? Before? There it is. So it's kind of squeezed into the penultimate day of a very busy, very intensive course, and I wasn't allowed to put it earlier in the course, and I asked. So, with that, I have a certain number of considerations.